For millions of years, the skies were the exclusive domain of the birds, the bats, and the butterflies. For millennia, men have watched them, envied them, and sought to emulate them. But it's only in the last century that we've succeeded in joining them in the adventure of powered flight. In that short time, flying has evolved from a perilous enterprise to the safest mode of transport the world has ever seen. We owe much of that to the developing technology, but it's also due to the skill and training of those who operate the planes, the pilots. The modern-day commercial pilot is a very different person to those early pioneers. Aviator, navigator, meteorologist, engineer, and team manager. The contemporary pilot needs all of these skills to operate in the modern aviation industry. In the previous episodes of this series, we have looked at the training of commercial pilots, from aspiring recruits to qualified pilots ready for their first post as a first officer in a modern commercial airline. However, during the final editing of this series in 2020, the world was hit with the coronavirus pandemic. In the first few weeks of the year, the commercial airline sector was hit by the biggest slump in history, with devastating consequences for everyone in the industry, including the pilots. Pilot training is a continuously evolving process. Whenever there is an accident or near accident, the event is thoroughly investigated in forensic detail. This not only identifies technical issues with aircraft, but also indicates situations where human error has contributed to or directly caused the problem. This enables the civil aviation community to improve pilot training to adjust to a constantly changing environment. The concept of the multi-crew cooperation course emerged from such analysis. Recently, aeroplane upset and loss of control have been identified as major risk factors that can lead to fatal accidents. And now, upset prevention and recovery training, or UPRT, has become a mandatory part of pilot training. The British Aerobatic Academy, based at Falmere in Cambridgeshire, is a leading provider of this type of training. Here, commercial pilot trainees are introduced to a very different and exciting type of flying.
My name is Adrian Willis. I run the British Aerobatic Academy, and we are specialised in upset prevention and recovery training. Now, upset prevention and recovery training is training that was introduced as a result of the Air France crash a few years ago, and is now mandatory for all airline pilots to complete it before they do their first type rating. We do about 1,000 UPRT courses a year, making us by far the biggest purveyor of these courses in the world. The course is 5 hours of ground school and 3 hours of flying, but the 3 hours of flying is probably the most intensive extreme flying the student pilots will have done in their career to date. Most people take a couple of days to do it because it's quite stressful and quite tiring. We start off by treating the aircraft like an airliner, so we constrain the flying controllers so that it rolls like an airliner, and we teach them to recover from stalls and unusual attitudes in a manner that would be appropriate for large jets. And it's good. It gives them experience of extreme attitudes, and that in itself reduces the shock and the startle effect that they're likely to encounter if they're unfortunate enough to see the real thing in training. And of course, Jamie was one of our flying instructor students, and of course flies in our aerobatic aircraft. When you're practiced in aerobatics, your spatial awareness is substantially enhanced, and also you develop seat of the pants flying. The average commercial pilot traditionally came out of training with tremendous skill at driving effectively a computer. And when things went wrong, they struggled, hence the introduction of UPRT training. But the aerobatic pilot, of course, rather than being stuck with instruments, feels the aircraft fly and for example, recovering from a stalled position and pointing the nose towards the ground is second nature. We start the course by teaching stall recovery. A stall is when the nose of the aircraft rises such that the airflow begins to separate from the wing. It can be quite a catastrophic event in the case of Air France, where the pilots didn't know how to recover and they basically followed the aircraft down into the ground. So we teach them that sort of recovery, and then we put the aircraft in a stalled position in more unusual attitudes. For example, in a steep turn with top rudder applied and a steep turn with bottom rudder applied, so it flicks and gives some startle and surprise element to the training.
For me, the main things which sort of upset me in flight, as the upset recovery training sort of says it's going to do, is spins. Spins for me are the worst. It makes me feel like I'm going to throw up, and if that's not uncommon amongst students, and that's mainly because they're just not used to these things, and that's what UPart's there to do, is to make you used to these unusual situations. People should not be discouraged by the fact that you feel ill on these sort of training courses. The more you do it, the more you get used to it, and it's actually inspired me to go forwards, and I will end up doing the basic aerobatics course here at British Aviation Academy. I'd say that the UPart A course was extremely valuable for me, and one of my most favourite parts of training.
The training to become a commercial pilot is demanding. There is a lot to learn and many skills to acquire, but with dedication, application and resilience, this is achievable by most who pass the aptitude criteria. Sadly, however, what stops most people from achieving their ambition of being a commercial pilot is simply the money.
I think what tends to put people off is the money. It is expensive, no way around that, but assuming you stick it out and pass everything, you'll be very well paid afterwards. So.
Aside from that, you do need the funding, which can sort of stop people at that point. It's sort of upwards of £100,000.
The barriers to being a pilot is predominantly the cost. As I've mentioned, it can cost up to £120,000 to become a pilot through an airline school. You've got to fund that. You won't get a bank loan anywhere in the UK to fund that training, so you're relying on the bank of mum and dad.
I want to kill a few myths that airlines are paying for people to get their licence. They don't and never will. I think it's one of those things we've just gone too far.
The issue of financing, who pays for pilot training, is a controversial one. No UK airlines pay for pilot training, and there is no access to the student loan system for this type of education. BALPA is presently exploring the idea of using the newly established apprenticeship scheme to help aspiring pilots. But the situation remains that most trainee pilots have to finance themselves through training. Nearly 20% of that is VAT. That amounts to about £16,000 just to pay the tax. Pilot training is one of the few professional training courses to carry this tax. You do not need to pay VAT on university education, legal, medical, or veterinary training. Nor do you pay VAT on flight training in most European countries.
I'm on the understanding that BALPA are starting to do an apprenticeship scheme for pilots.
That's correct. We're concerned as a trade union that there's a lack of social mobility. Therefore, a lot of people are locked out in realising their dream of being a pilot, can't afford it, and they don't have the means to secure the funding to pay for their training. The government launched an apprenticeship levy, which means that every UK business with a wage bill of over 3 million are required to give 0.5% of that wage bill to the apprenticeship levy. It's compulsory. However, the companies and businesses can get some of that money back by having their own apprenticeship schemes. So this has created a lot of interest in the UK, and of course the opportunity to have a pilot apprenticeship has something that we've been wanting to support.
At present, more than half of trainee pilots rely on some sort of financial support from their families. It leaves students hunting for the cheapest options and leads many to go abroad. We risk losing pilots and our whole training industry to rising foreign competition. The degree of social exclusion this creates is obvious. Many potential pilots are forced to abandon their ambitions because of this lack of finance. The British Association of Airline Pilots sees the financing of training as the biggest hurdle that aspiring pilots face. They are actively campaigning to address this issue. In the meantime, the financial barriers remain, and for some it becomes an impenetrable barrier to cross. Eric has spent the last 10 years trying to achieve his dream. His story is typical of many.
The story goes all the way back to 1930s when my great-granddad was part of a task force sent to Spain to fight the fascist Franco's forces between 1936 and 1939. The only thing I've got left of him is a picture of him in uniform in front of his plane, as due to a Stalinist regime, upon coming back, they were all executed with the entire squadron to keep the secret safe. My mum was always passionate about planes and aviation. She traveled as much as she could within the close Soviet Union. But becoming a woman as a pilot back in those days was a very, very challenging task, especially if we're talking about Soviet Union. I've never thought that I would ever even get onto the path of wanting to realistically be a pilot. In my country's education is very, very tough. I remember when I was 10 years old, I asked my teacher what it does it take to become a pilot and if I can do it, and I was very much told to Eric, it's not for you, just forget about it. Then 2013 I applied to my first British Airways scheme, and I've gotten to a second stage of assessments. 2017 the next scheme happened, which was the Virgin Atlantic scheme, and out of according to various reports, from 10 to 12,000 people, I've gone down to last 45. But since 2017, I've been preparing every single day for another scheme, and it never happened.
I mean, as you've experienced firsthand, unless you've got the means to pay for your flight training, you're relying on the schemes to be released by the airlines, but they're very few and far between, and because of that, you have extraordinary numbers of applicants for just a handful of jobs.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
You know, the situation you're in now is echoed by hundreds and hundreds of individuals that are equally waiting on the sidelines.
Yeah. You've got training academies left, right and centre giving you leaflets telling you to just do it, just get into the academy, fantastic job, and they give you a leaflet with £50,000 on it, £70,000, £100,000.
Yes.
And sometimes I don't feel like I'm on the same planet. To save £1,000 working by yourself in London it is a great feat.
Eric's latest plan is to try and use the power of the internet to bypass the financial institutions and borrow directly from the public.
What I have done at this moment in time for myself, but hopefully on behalf of everyone in the UK who struggles to become a pilot right now, is a campaign called Wings for Change. It is a GoFundMe campaign that will try to raise money for my pilot license costs. But through that, I pledge to donate every single pound that I get back into good causes.
During the final weeks of filming and editing this series, the world was hit by COVID-19. The world of international commercial aviation is accustomed to swings in fortune. It has survived previous pandemics such as swine flu in 2009. The global financial crisis of 2008 caused a minor temporary downturn in activity, but the combination of the two created a perfect storm for the airline industry. Nothing since the Second World War has caused so much disruption as the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. The combined effect of travel restrictions and the economic slump that followed caused a catastrophic collapse in commercial aviation and disaster for many who worked in it. The speed with which the crisis unfolded left no time for contingency planning. The World Health Organization's assessment moved from a public health emergency of international concern to a full-blown pandemic in less than 6 weeks. In March 2020, the US closed its skies to Europe.
By mid-April, 2/3 of the global passenger fleet of aircraft were in mass long-term storage, in depots nicknamed boneyards.
The pandemic was catastrophic for travel and aviation, as well as hospitality. Many industries have been affected, but in terms of aviation and the pilot community, their flights were grounded kind of overnight. And although cargo operations have been going over the last 18 months on some passenger routes, the cutbacks have been, well, nothing like we've seen before. In terms of our pilot community, we've had over 2,000 lose their jobs in the UK, and many more have had to take part-time contracts. A pilot has to have SIM checks every year, has to have a medical. That's expensive, it incurs a cost, but that's covered by the employer. But when you're made redundant, you have a licence that you actually, which you quite rightly say, needs to remain valid. And to do that, you have to spend money. You have to spend a certain amount of time in the simulator, you would have to be checked by a qualified training captain, and that all costs money. More and more we're seeing our pilots that have been made redundant aren't able to retain their valid licence. Hence why we're running a programme on looking at their transferable skills and helping them move into other sectors that are emerging. It's sad, but it's something as a union we have felt completely necessary. So we contacted the BALPA entire pilot membership and asked those that were training pilots if they would volunteer their time and take part in a register and provide their services either at free or at cost when the sim sessions took place. So we were overwhelmed and quite humbled by the amount of members, hundreds, that came forward are on that register, which is available to all our redundant pilots to tap into. And then I contacted the major simulator providers in Europe, explaining that I was trying to set up a project to support redundant pilots, and they all provided what's called a BALPA discount, so our redundant pilots can get a sim at a really good cost and a trainer that they need to have with them in the simulator to validate their training. So that's a really good example of the community coming together.
Inevitably, the pandemic has been particularly tough on the newly qualified pilots. As the world was assaulted by wave after wave of virus infections, BALPA even suggested that hopeful pilots should postpone their training.
It's another narrative, but the issue we have here is we've now got new pilots that have just qualified. There's no employment opportunities for them. If there are, they're very slim. There might be a few instructor jobs. The problem we now have is we've got a marketplace flooded with qualified pilots and newly qualified pilots that haven't got any work experience and no flying hours under their belt, which is very important. Their opportunities to get employment are going to be about 2, maybe 3 years away. They're left with that debt to service. That £80,000 to £130,000 still has to be serviced. And if they want to be a pilot still in the future, they've got to remain current. So they're going to have to spend more money on retaining the validity of that licence they've just qualified and paid for. So it's not a great time. And BALPA, we've been suggesting to those that are thinking about starting flight training, slow it down, look for some market recovery, and also look at modular training where you can perhaps work and learn at the same time, therefore building up a skill set in a different sector that you might need further down the line.
However, the chaos that has been caused by the pandemic has not deterred the next generation of hopeful pilots.
And a lot of people have asked me why I decided to start my course during the restrictions and during COVID being so prominent. And personally, for me, it was, I've always wanted to do this, and I think the opportunity was there, and I wasn't going to sit around waiting because, to be honest, I was fed up of waiting, and I was ready to get started, I was ready to get going. And I have huge kind of belief that the airline industry will bounce back very quickly when restrictions ease, because I think the main difference between COVID and 9/11 is that people aren't afraid to fly, it's whether they can legally go to a destination or not. And I think after 2 years of being sat at home and being very restricted to where you can and can't go, as soon as the opportunity arises to be able to fly to the likes of the USA or parts of Europe, I think anyone would jump at the opportunity to do that. And I think The industry is obviously at a lull, but personally I think it will boom, because the industry's booming all the time, and with every aircraft you buy you need more pilots, more cabin crew to serve the customers. So I see no reason why after this pandemic the aviation industry should not bounce back. It should, with all the strength it has and carries. And I strongly believe that the prospects of pilots, we will get jobs.
The future for the airline industry is challenging. As the world emerges from the COVID pandemic, the most recent pressing problem the industry faces is probably becoming carbon neutral. Whether that is achieved from using biofuel, electrical, or developing hydrogen-powered aircraft remains to be seen. What is unlikely is that people's need for air travel will decline in the future, and the demand for pilots will remain. As flying commercial aircraft become safer and more automated, some have questioned whether pilots will be needed at all in the future. However, two of the most serious accidents in modern times have been due to an excessive reliance on automation. These situations arose where the automatic systems were being fed erroneous data and overrode the commands of the pilot, who realised that the data was faulty. Computer algorithms will only respond to input data. To question that input can only come from a brain that can think and reason, a pilot. For pilots, the challenges are to develop and maintain skills. They must be proficient at dealing with situations where things are going wrong, but in modern aircraft, that tends to happen infrequently. Pilots increasingly rely on simulators to maintain their skills, especially in emergency situations. But simulators are expensive pieces of equipment, and you need one for each type of aircraft. One of the answers to this may come from virtual reality or VR systems. These are already in use for training surgeons and other professionals, and would be cheaper and more versatile for training pilots, meaning that they will need less time in the simulator. Another development is the Rolls-Royce Future Systems Simulator. The simulator emulates a flight deck and can be configured to represent aircraft of different types and sizes. This will allow pilots to focus on problems ranging from handling qualities of novel aircraft configurations to information required to improve pilot decision-making. The speed at which technology develops accelerates with each passing year and makes predicting the future notoriously difficult. In 2019, it was unthinkable that a virus could cripple the global airline industry within weeks. It is unlikely to be the last pandemic, and other challenges are already upon us. The turbulence brought about by climate change and the urgent need to make the industry carbon neutral will bring major challenges to the world of commercial aviation and those working within it. Aspiring pilots face demanding and expensive training and much uncertainty in their future. Why do they do it?
So what could you say that you're letting me in for in this career then?
Crikey, thrills and spills, lots of money, lots of travel, and the best office view in the world.
I've always wanted to fly from a very young age, and I was lucky enough to start my flying training back in 2004.
Okay.
And I finished in 2006. And I took the modular pathway. So I did my course bit by bit as sort of time and finances allowed. As I say, finished in 2006.
Yeah, so my dad is a commercial pilot, and he first introduced me to gliding when I was 15. And I really loved it as a hobby. I just kept it ticking over while I was at school. But it wasn't until a lot later on, like during university, that I realised that I really wanted to be a commercial pilot.
I used to run out into the garden when I was maybe 2 or 3 years old, running outside into the garden, pointing into the sky and shouting "Conquer, conquer," not being able to pronounce Concord properly. I just think my passion for aviation is philosophy.
I'd always known that I wanted to be a pilot. I don't know why. I think my granddad probably had something to do with it. He was always involved in some kind of aviation engineering, be it sitting on his knee, playing with flight simulators, Always sort of loving aviation, go to museums, those sorts of things. I just had to learn to fly.
I used to sit in the garden, look up, and there's all these little aircrafts flying around, mainly because there's a little sort of grass landing strip near my village in Willingham. And I said to my parents one year, wouldn't it be lovely to have a Christmas present that was sort of...
When I grow up, I really want to be a pilot.